Okay.
Did you bring a text? Aye.
I know you told me.
Told you to.
You did.
You never listen to me. Okay. Yone Huringe Shikyo
Jinje Zushin Denpa Langi Tsawaru Lekpa Dune Beba Dumai Kurba Jember Denpa Jingilo Lenche Nibe Dewe Denzandi Shinto Nyeka Tenshin Shinjo Yinzen Kunto Nyingo Lembe Lo Ginje Memba Kewa Jingilo Luto Yawa Chui Chubu Shin Nyordu Jikpe Chiwa Jemba Dam Shiwe Jesu Luda Jema Shin Karna Linde Chishin Tawala Nyeva Tembo Nyene Nyevo Chashin Chawa Nangyang Pongwa Dam Kezo Dada Juba Chebala Tadu Badan Temba Jingilo Chibe Mingon Dune Kuigi Go Yite Miru Sibe Punzogi Nimiringe Tabe Dewala Tunye Jimbo Gewa Jingilo Nanda Zamba Deyi Jambayi Dendan Shishimbayu Jimboyi Jimbe Zawa Soso Darbala Juba Nyingbo Cheba Jingilo Rani Siso Luan Chishindu Maigyo Jowa Kunkan De Jawara Tungne Jowa Jowe Kurgyarwe Chanju Senjo Jomba Jingilo Senzange Kyan Zutin Namsun La Komba Mena Chanju Miruba Leva Dune Gaze Dombala Zamba Jabur Loba Jingilo Lobe Yule Yenwa Shishing Yanga Dana Sushin Shabai Shine La Don Zundu Jawela Yudu Gila Gawa Jingilo Tumu Lanjan Udu Gurbana Teva Quingi Choiku Dorje Te Kesa Kewo Jumo Damba Dera Tela Nidu Chuba Jingilo Teze Mudu Nani Trubeshi Nanda Damsi Tomba Zungwala Chama Mimbe Nimba Nigurne Sotan Dute Zungwa Jingilo Tene Kyute Ningo Rinyiki Tena Jishin Tongne Zumbayi Tujine Jojo Le Miyowa Tambe Sujin Juba Jingilo Tedalang San Tembe Shinyen Dan Zushin Jumbe Jonan Shabdin Jing Shidan Nangi Bardu Jebetso Niwar Shiwar Jingi Labdu Zo Tewa Kundu Yanga Lama Jame Chiki Pela Longshu Jing Saran Lungi Yuden Razo Nen Dorje Shangi Gopan Yorto Sho Sangye Cheran Zogi Jonam La Chanshu Bardo Dani Gyosuji Dagi Cheshe Gibe Sanagi Jola Benshir Sangye Trubasha Sangye Cheran Zogi Jonam La Chanshu Bardo Dani Gyosuji Dagi Cheshe Gibe Sanagi Jola Bencher Sangye Drupara Sho Sangye Cheran Zogi Chonamla Janjo Bardu Dani Kyabsuchi Dagi Jinyan Gibe Sonamgi Jola Bencher Sangye Drupara Sho Saji Bugi Jushin Medan Dram Rira Lingjin Inde Gembandi Sangye Shindu Mikde Wargi Jogun Namna Shingla Jobar Shol Irama Guru Ratna Mandala Kam Niriyata
Okay. So, Here we are again. Uh, Guess not. All right, so we've been reading Arya Deva's verse text on the Bodhisattva practice. First 4 chapters of which deal with the topics of the 4 mistaken beliefs, for erring beliefs about impermanence and suffering, selflessness. 2 ways of thinking about selflessness. So we finished the first chapter about impermanence, and so I thought it would be interesting to read a presentation on this topic that deals with subtle impermanence, which is a subject that is not, often discussed, in my experience, in Dharma, teachings. Not that it isn't studied in the monasteries, but my impression is that it's considered a topic that is difficult to explain for the average layperson. So, for instance, in the Lamrim instruction, it really is not addressed directly at all, that I can recall. Anyway, I happened to read this particular presentation. It's from one of Asanga's texts, which is a text that's attributed to Asanga. It's one of the sections of the so-called Yogacara Bhumi, which has 17 sections to it, 2 of which are really major in their size and scope. 13th section is called the Shravaka Bhumi, and that is a treatise on basically the entire subject matter for a practitioner of the Shravaka tradition, just as the Bodhisattva Bhumi is for the Mahayana practitioner. Anyway, in the Shravaka Bhumi section, there's a lot of material that is found interspersed in Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chemo. If you're familiar with it, I mean, you recognize them. For instance, one section of the Shravaka Bhumi discusses shamatha, which is obviously an important topic in the latter part of the Lamrim Chemo. And my kind of impression of it is that that's probably one of the most informative and really gives a lot of insight into what the nature of that practice involves. Anyway, this section that we're going to read comes towards the very end of the Shravaka Bhumi. So the Shravaka Bhumi talks about, in the latter part, talks about 2 paths. It talks about the so-called worldly path versus the transcendent path. And by worldly path, it means the method of practice by which a meditator develops the various stages of meditative absorption. So, for instance, the 4 dhyanas. I know shamatha is kind of, a very important sort of element of that. In that, actually, shamatha, I don't know if you're aware of it or not, shamatha is considered one of the stages of concentration that precede attaining the first dhyana, for example. First dhyana is considered part of the form realm, and shamatha is one of actually 6 different stages that culminate in attainment of the first dhyana. So there, the terms in Tibetan Hatong and Shine Hatong, right? Shine is shamatha, Hatong is vipassana, and so practice of the path is often described as practicing them jointly. Sungdujelo means in combination. So in order to achieve, for instance, Tonglang, to achieve the path of seeing, the transcendent path really begins with the attainment of seeing, path of seeing. You traverse the path that culminates in the path of seeing by cultivating shamatha and vipassana, jointly, in combination, so to speak. So just as it's done in that so-called transcendent path, there's a similar, it's analogous, a form of vipassana for the worldly path. In other words, to get from the attainment of the first level of shamatha to the first dhyana in the worldly path is considered to be accomplished by a form of vipassana practice. And it's totally different from the transcendent form, because in the transcendent path, you're meditating on the Four Noble Truths, for instance. In the worldly path, you are meditating using a technique that's called Shiraki Nambache. Shiwa means to think of the more higher state of awareness as being more peaceful and more favorable and more attractive even, and the level that you're at as being rapa, as being coarser and less desirable. And so this is sort of this idea of wanting to you focus on the disadvantages of the lower level and the advantages of the higher level, and in using various kinds of techniques, and you are cultivating a form of what is called vipassana. You may I don't know how carefully you may or may not have read the Lamrim Choma, but actually Tsongkhapa talks about that form of practice in the Lamrim Choma. I believe it's at the end of the Shina section. At any rate, so here, so he talks about that in the Shravaka Bhumi, Asanga Jones, and basically talks about how you can attain those various levels of the dhyanas, the 4 dhyanas, and even the 4 levels of the formless realm. So apparently, I'm not an authority or an expert, but apparently there are certain kinds of practitioners who are drawn to cultivating those meditative states, in more, in a more rigorous way, maybe than other practitioners are. So, in fact, I'm sort of digressing, but I think maybe it's interesting. There is in the Parching, Parching course in Gelugpa schools is mainly addressing the Prajnaparamita Sutra. and it's an analysis of the Prajnaparamita based on the Abhisamaya Alankara. So you're probably aware of that. Then within the Parchin course, there's a very interesting section which is called Gindun Nishu. Gindun Nishu means the 20 Sanghas. And what that refers to is, so there are, in the Shravaka system, there are 4 fruits of the path, and there are 4 types of Aryas who achieve those fruits. So first one is called the stream enterer, then there's the once returner, then the non-returner, and then Arhat. Those are kind of the 4 basic types of Arya Sangha individuals. And then depending on how a Hinayana practitioner navigates the path from the point of becoming a so-called stream enterer after achieving the seeing path up to Arhatship, then there are 20 different varieties of individuals. And so that's a subject that is known, for instance, in the more traditional Agdharma literature. So interestingly, in the Prajnaparamita, now I'm really digressing. In the Prajnaparamita, they take a Mahayana approach to discussing different kinds of Mahayana Aryas. Of course, the Mahayana Aryas are not trying to achieve Arhatship, in the way that the Hinayanists are, but the same terminology for those 20 different types of practitioners are used and are sort of reinterpreted within the Mahayana context. So it's very interesting. Anyway, the point of it is that some practitioners will find themselves developing all the various types of meditative absorption, and one of the things that is the result of that is that they achieve all kinds of miraculous powers, all kinds of muenshe, right? The supernormal kind of knowledge, and to the extent that they develop higher states of meditative absorption, their super normal knowledge is more acute, for instance. And so it's kind of an area of doctrine that deals with different kinds of practitioners. Some of them sharper faculty, some of them less sharp faculty. So anyway, here, after having discussed all of that in the Shravaka Bhumi, I'm not saying that he discusses the 20 Sanghas so much, but after he's discussed the so-called worldly path, where he describes cultivating the dhyanas, for instance, then he comes at the very end. This is the very end of the book, actually, where he discusses how the practitioner cultivates the transcendent path and then ultimately achieves Arhatship. And then, that marks the end of the Shravaka Bhumi. So this is kind of the beginning of that discussion. So let's see. So with that introduction, and if you have it. You have it. Probably not too many. You have
your phone is sent email.
Yeah, but my phone is kind of
Not happening.
Oh, you have it printed out? Starting at the beginning, it should say meditating on the truth of suffering. Do you remember I brought like about 10 copies of.
Yeah,
That's the one
I
you
apologize.
sent
I
out.
didn't bring the
Yeah.
paperwork with me
No,
today.
We got 2 emails.
Right.
One
One has the English.
in the button.
Yeah.
But I think today
Was another one.
something else.
Oh,
Is
that was
what
a
you
sutra,
referred
a short sutra.
to? Okay.
Yeah.
But this is the one you referred to, the one I printed it out.
What does it say? Meditation on truth of suffering?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so that's what we're going to read.
I can look at it on my phone and somebody wants to take my hard copy. I got from Mark anyway.
If someone wants to read out, he's often
You have it?
I have a,
But she has it, right? Oh, somebody else back there? Who's in the back? Huh? Oh, okay. Karen. Well, yeah. Looks like it. Okay, so so I don't know. You know, taking up a half an hour almost, just introducing this. I don't know. We need to read it word for word, the entire excerpt, but I'd like to go through it and introduce you to it enough that you've become familiar with it, and then you can look at it yourself at your leisure and hopefully get something out of it. Also, in this book, Inner Science, I actually do discuss and some of the material that's in this. This is obviously too long to put in the book in its entirety, but I talked a little bit about how this goes about. So what I have here is just the part on the truth of suffering. So the Four Noble Truths, right, are each of the Four Noble Truths has four aspects to it, so-called aspects to it, which are ways in which to meditate on those specific truths. So what we're looking at here is the presentation on the truth of suffering. The four aspects of truth of suffering are impermanence, by which is meant subtle impermanence; suffering, by which is mainly meant the suffering of conditioned existence; something called emptiness, which is not the Mahayana emptiness, but which is a way of understanding the skandhas as lacking any self, sort of existing in the absence of any self. And then the fourth aspect is selflessness itself. So these are the four aspects of the truth of suffering. And this discussion goes through all of those and takes them up in 10 different points. He actually calls them aspects. So how many? I think 7 of them, all right, or 5 of them. The first 5 relate to impermanence. Then 3 relate to suffering. And then the last 2, 1 each for emptiness and selflessness. So what's interesting about this, which I hope you'll agree, is that it's presented in the form of how to meditate on it. Okay, so let's read some of it, and then maybe as we go through it, I can make some observations and how it's saying. So it starts out here. It says, now there is, and then I add in brackets words that are not in the original, but are sort of clarified a little bit more. So it says, it would say something which we translate: one who is desirous of proceeding by means of the transcendent path. Okay, so this means somebody who is not necessarily. They have to have some level of understanding and development of one-pointed concentration in order to be able to develop. They have to at least have achieved shamatha, right? So shamatha alone is sufficient to be able to traverse the transcendent path. Or you can use the level of the first dhyana or second dhyana. At any rate, the person who's achieved at least shamatha then can begin to cultivate vipassana, and then use the two to alternate between them in order to progress first from the second path, the so-called path of preparation, right? So Jorlam. Jorlam is preparation in the sense that it leads to, or it takes you to the transcendent path of seeing. So in order to, so there is a kind of a definition almost of what it takes in order to enter the second path, the path of preparation. So in order to enter the first path, the so-called path of accumulation, you have to have developed genuine renunciation. Okay, so that's the kind of the entry point for the path. And then during the Toblam, you are cultivating virtues, which are ripening you, and you're learning, you're developing an understanding of doctrine, you're developing listening wisdom, and then at some point, you're trying to cultivate Samjongishira, right? Samjongishira is the second type of wisdom, which literally means the wisdom which is has the nature of, or which is derived from reflection. And so in Buddhist epistemology, that means in order to develop that second level of wisdom, you have to generate a form of valid inference. And when you develop that form of valid inference, then that becomes a type of knowledge. And then using that knowledge, you can cultivate shamatha in relation to that understanding of impermanence, for example. And then once you've achieved shamatha, then you want to try to understand the nature of that impermanence more directly, more experientially. And so you start to cultivate vipassana. At that point, where you are cultivating on the platform of shamatha with impermanence, for example, as your object, and you're trying to penetrate into the meaning of that impermanence with your discriminating awareness, then it starts to become vipassana. Then that marks the beginning of Jorlam, beginning of the second path. From there, as you cultivate the combination of shamatha and vipassana, then slowly you progress towards the direct yogic realization that constitutes achieving the path of seeing. So here we're talking about the person who is at that point of cultivating prayoga marga, right? The jorlam, the second path, path of preparation. So here, he says some of what he says. I'll comment on it so you can understand kind of the language that he's using. So he says, there's a practitioner who's desirous of proceeding by means of the transcendent path. Okay, so we're saying the person is going to be meditating on Four Noble Truths. In relation to the Four Noble Truths, he or she successively develops the 7 forms of attention. And this attention means manaskara. And those are described in this book. If you look in there are it's just these 7 forms of attention represent kind of how you engage the object, right? Attention means manaskara. Manaskara means how you bring something to mind, how you engage an object in your mind. And so these 7 different forms of attention kind of represent ways in which you're reflecting on whatever subject you're meditating on, the form that it takes. So it says here, beginning with the one which repeatedly analyzes properties. Okay, that's the name of the first attention. And ends with the one called the fruit of having completed the practice. So the 7th one, called the fruit of having completed the practice, is the form of attention that, I don't remember exactly whether it means you've already attained arhatship or it's the kind of attention that you engage in as you are approaching, which culminates in achieving arhatship. At any rate, saying that this begins with Jorlam and ends with Miloblam, right? In the Hinayana path. So those 7, if I wouldn't be surprised, it's in the index. It should be. I didn't make this index, so I'm not sure how it's arranged. No, it's not under 7, so let's see, attention maybe. Yes, okay. So here, there's an entry in the index called attention, which is manaskara, and then at the very end there's 2. So there are the 7 forms of attention in the mundane path, right? The mundane path is the path where you're cultivating the dhyanas, for instance, the states of meditative absorption. So there's that's a form of vipassana that pertains to not directly meditating on the Four Noble Truths, but trying to cultivate higher levels of meditative absorption. And then a second set of 7 forms of attention using the same terminology, using the same names, but which are describing an entirely different process of meditation that relates to the transcendent path. So at any rate, they're listed here, and I think they're mentioned in the Abhidharma Samuccaya. I might have even taken them from the Abhidharma Samuccaya, and I think maybe the descriptions of them from the commentary of the Abhidharma Samuccaya. At any rate, they're in here, and they relate to, the way in which you are reflecting on whether it's the worldly path or, in this case, the transcendent path. So the first one, it says that which repeatedly analyzes properties, means that you are, you're cultivating, you're reflecting, you're meditating on the various attributes that are associated with understanding impermanence, suffering, and so on. Okay. Okay, so here it says, with regard to this, the meditation, now we're talking, this is now, in this case, we're only talking about the transcendent path. So it says, with regard to this, the meditation practitioner who has listened to, okay, so that refers to listening wisdom, right? Person who has listened to and taken up the Four Noble Truths in both an abbreviated and a detailed form. So it means you're familiar with, you understand the doctrine, and who is either someone who has cultivated well the state of one-pointed attention. I think that, yeah. Subhavita manaskara, you see it down at the bottom, right? The first, second footnote. That term, the one who has I translated it as cultivated well a state of one-pointed attention, that's actually a phrase that refers to shamatha. So it means either the person who has achieved just shamatha, right, or someone who has attained the main stage of any of the meditative absorptions, right? So the first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana. In other words, you have to have been someone who has attained one of those levels of one-pointed concentration that are a prerequisite and necessary quality for meditating on vipassana or cultivating vipassana, right? So he says, repeatedly analyzes. Now here he's saying this is now he's describing this first form of attention, which represents a kind of vipassana. Repeatedly analyzes the properties of the truth of suffering in terms of its 4 aspects, which are the aspect of impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and selflessness. Okay, so far should be everything familiar to you. Then here he just mentions, in relation to that, then the same for the other 3 truths, right? He or she also repeatedly analyzed the properties of truth of origination and truth of cessation and the truth of the path in terms of its 4 aspects. And here just the names of those aspects are also presented, right? This constitutes his or her form of attention, which is called that which repeatedly analyzes properties. All right? So saying the first level of practicing vipassana means to reflect on your correct inferential understanding of the meaning of each of the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths and sort of try to penetrate into what that meaning, how it sort of basically kind of trying to understand it in a more kind of direct way. Okay, so this is the introductory statement. All right. I guess it's easier just to go through the English rather than try to read through the Tibetan. So, okay, so what we're going to do today, hopefully, is get through the material on the first aspect of the Noble Truth of Suffering, namely impermanence. This should be familiar for you. This is what we did in Connecticut, right? It's the same text even. Right. Okay, so here it says, with regard to this, so this is just an introductory phrase. With regard to this, it means pertaining to this, this introductory statement, he says, the person who investigates the truth of suffering on the basis of 10 topics will enter into its 4 aspects. So here, Asanga is saying that he's going to talk about the 4 aspects of the Noble Truth of Suffering in terms of 10 sort of meditation topics. All right. And then here he lists them. Okay, they are as follows. They're numbered, and the ones that relate to impermanence are the first 5. Okay, the aspect of change, the aspect of perishability, the aspect of separation, the aspect of the ultimate nature of things, and the aspect of an impermanence that is present. And this represents Asanga's then formulation of how the meditator really engages subtle impermanence and starts to cultivate it, meditate on it. So I hope this is something that you find instructive, even just in an abstract way. Whether any of us ever gets to the point where we could conceivably cultivate this the way it's being described, that's a tall order, but even understanding it is, I think, has a very positive effect, can have a very positive effect on you. Very least can deepen your faith. Okay, so here, now he lists these 10, he calls them aspects. I refer to them here as topics, but actually, I think he says, number 2. Yeah. So he uses the word aspect for these 10 points. All right. So don't confuse these 10 points with the 4 aspects of the Noble Truth of Suffering. Right? So the first 5 of them relate to impermanence. Okay. Now this is something that I think is worth sort of discussing a little bit more about. So here, let's see if he uses the term. Yes, okay. Actually, we jumped over it. So at the very end of this paragraph where Asanga lists these 10 points, the last thing he says, these 10 aspects, last sentence, right? Moreover, these 10 aspects are investigated by means of the application that relates to demonstration of a proof. Okay, that's an important term. So I want to talk about that a little bit. Okay, so you notice there's a footnote here that addresses what are called 4 applications. This is my term, application. In Tibetan, they are known as rikbashi. Are you familiar with that? That formulation, rikbashi? So this comes mainly in Yogacara literature, it's so it's common in whether it's found in the Sanya Nirmochana Sutra. These 4 rikpas. And they're mentioned. Of course, the Yogacara literature, a lot of it was translated into Tibetan, and so in native Tibetan works, they will refer to these. For instance, anything that relates to the Yogacara school, whether it's the Mahayana Sutra Alankara, which is an important work, or any of the other 5, Maitreya works. this formulation of Rikpa-chi, it's often sort of referred to. Now, the Tibetans, because of the word Rikpa, Tibetans take this to mean reason, right? So I more or less accepted that that's what the term meant. But anyway, I don't want to get off too much on a tangent. But I looked up. I found there's actually a discussion of these four so-called Rikpas in the Shravakabhumi. The Shravakabhumi probably gives one of the most detailed discussion of them. And what I found was that Asanga uses terms as synonyms for Rikpa. One is tab, and one is jorwa. So actually the Sanskrit word is yukti, and then the synonyms that he uses for it are upaya and yoga. And those terms suggest something broader than a reason, in the sense of some kind of sort of, some kind of reflective or some kind of analytical way of addressing things. So I translated the term as application. And what's interesting is that in the Shravakabhumi, Asanga introduces this topic in the section on Samba. Samba means then reflection. So he talks about Turba, which is listening or learning, right? Which would be where you become introduced to the doctrine in terms of scriptural teachings and terminology, and coming to understand what the subjects are about. And then the next level is Samba, is how to then, in a more in a more systematic way or in a more rigorous way, you reflect on it. And so that's where he introduces this notion of these four Rikpas. Okay, so so they're listed here in this footnote, the four Rikpas. I call them applications. And here he says that in this situation where the practitioner is going to be meditating on the aspects of the Four Noble Truths, he's going to investigate them by means of the application that relates to demonstration of a proof. Right? That's called Tebe Drube Rikpa. Teba is then a proof. Druba means established. Rikpa means an application. The application that relates to establishing something on the basis of some kind of reasoning, or then some kind of justification. Okay, and so that represents one of these four applications. So what does that actually mean? Okay, so here is this is a passage from the Shravakabhumi where Asanga is talking about these four Rikpas. Okay, and so he says, I'm just reading the one part which deals with Tebe Drube Rikpa. He says, so what is the application that relates to demonstration of a proof? And he says, okay, the assertions that, this is a translation, this is his own language, Asanga's statement. The assertions that the heaps are impermanent, that they are dependently arisen, right? That they have a nature that consists of suffering, that they are empty of a self, right? That so far in those three phrases, two of the four aspects of truths of suffering have been alluded to. That they do not constitute a self, that's another one, third one, are investigated using the three forms of authoritative knowledge. Okay, authoritative knowledge is my rendering of the word pramana, right? Pramana means sema. Sema is the epistemological term for correct cognition or right understanding, right? So it says 3 forms of tsema. So use 3 forms of tsema to investigate these statements, such as that the skandhas are impermanent, they constitute suffering, they're dependently arisen. And what are those 3? That is to say, number 1, agama, trustworthy scripture. So apta agama. Apta means a realized person. Apta agama means the pronouncements or the teachings or of the sayings of a realized person. In this case, that's a reference to the Buddha. So the agama means his collection of his canonical statements. So it's saying you rely, number 1, on authoritative scripture. That's one form of tsema, right? Number 2 is direct perception. Direct perception means those things which we can observe from our own experience. Wansum tsema, right? As a matter of fact, wansum tsema refers, I think it refers especially to a proper understanding of our experience. So, for instance, the doctrine of the 5 skandhas themselves, right, is the terminology and the subject matter that the Buddha himself formulated as kind of the basis for establishing the doctrine of the 4 noble truths, right? So what's the noble truth of suffering? The noble truth of suffering is the 5 impure heaps taken as a result, right? Similarly, the noble truth of origination is the same 5 skandhas taken from the perspective of being a cause. Okay, so so therefore, when we are introduced to the terminology and the expressions that describe and explain what the 5 skandhas are, it's not enough just to learn the terminology, but we actually, I believe, are meant to learn how to use that terminology and those explanations to examine our own experience in such a way that we sort of get a kind of a heightened sense of how to identify different aspects of our being. So that's an element of direct perception that's being referenced here. Okay, so in a sense, it's like saying you have to learn what the doctrine of the 5 skandhas is, and then you have to use that understanding to sort of identify what it's referring to within your own experience. And that itself is a kind of, I believe, it brings a kind of a level of a clearer understanding of what our own being consists of. So it's like if we think of the 5 skandhas, nowhere in the 5 skandhas is there a self, right? And the only time that the mental afflictions come up is not in terms of them as being in any way validated, but as a way of saying, look, here are these erroneous ways of thinking, and this is what we call them, right? Like, for instance, the 5 views, the 5 mistaken views, right? The mistaken belief in a real self, and the extreme view, and so on, right? So here, that's a form of authoritative knowledge, is authoritative knowledge about the 5 skandhas, for instance, okay? And then the third form of authoritative knowledge is inference, okay? Inference. So saying that this particular form of one of the 4 rikpas, of the rikpa, Tevidri rikpa, is to investigate some particular topic using those 3 then methods: relying on authoritative scripture, drawing attention to elements of our direct experience, and then finally teaching us how to draw inferences based on that previous examination, and then gaining some kind of insight. All right. So that's how this meditation is structured around that point. Okay? So it's important to understand what he means when he said that examining those 10 topics by means of the application that relates to a demonstration of the proof. Now, when we get to it now, the very first one about impermanence, that will become immediately evident, okay? Because guess where he starts? He starts with scriptural passage, okay? So in other words, you start by saying, this is what the Buddha had to say about the nature of impermanence. So he says, regarding this, first, a scriptural statement. And then he says, as the Lord declared, all conditioned entities, right? All conditioned entities here is then samskaras, right? Samskara, it's interesting because sometimes the term is used in the past tense. Samskrta. Samskrta means conditioned in past tense, created by causes and conditions. Sometimes it's used in this more active sense, samskaras, which means that they have some sort of active capacity. For instance, the fourth skanda is called samskara skanda. So that's looking at sort of in particular the mental elements that are active in terms of our mental capacities, then also in terms of how the mental afflictions operate. Also, it addresses what are the basic kinds of virtuous minds, and each of these represents a particular kind of samskara. So anyway, here he uses the word samskara rather than samskrta, but the two are kind of, they are coextensive, right? Every samskara is also a samskrta, right? Every samskrta, from the point of view of it's having an effect on other things, is also a samskara. Okay, so the first statement is, in Tibetan we would say, Duje Tamje Mitaka, right? Then this is, right? Do you know the term Kartaki Chagyashi? Kar means the Buddha's word. Right? Tak means those things which designate a doctrine as having been the word of the Buddha. The four seals, Chagyashi, are Duje Tamje Mitaka. Duje Tamje Mitaka means all composite or all conditioned things are impermanent. Sakwadan Jewa Tamje Dungel, right? All Sakwana Java means all things that are related to the quote outflows, which is a synonym for mental afflictions. All those things that are produced by the mental afflictions, or all those things that give rise to the mental afflictions, and all those things, by the way, means the five skandhas, right? So sometimes, typically, it's translated as impure skandhas. The five impure skandhas are inherently a form of suffering. They're inherently, something about them is unsatisfactory. We should not be, content with possessing the five impure skandhas. Then Chö Tamje Dongxing Dagmeva, right? Dongxing Dagmeva means, and these are the first four aspects of no true suffering, right? Mitakwa, Dungawa, Dongxing Dagmeva are the third and fourth aspects. And then Yanghenle Deva Shiwao, the last one is then in Nirvana, which is not one of the five skandhas, because it's an unconditioned entity, is peace. Right? So this is the first one then. Duje Tamje Mitakpa. Then regarding, then here it says, okay, so what are we talking about when we're talking about Duje Tamje? He says, conditioned entities are, those are the world that is made up of sentient beings, and those are the world that is their receptacle. Yeah.
Sorry.
It's all right. It just kind of keeps bumping up against me. So it just says, the five skandhas is not limited to sentient beings. The five skandhas also includes the inanimate world, right? And so, in fact, the inanimate world of the vessel in which samsaric beings reside is a part of the truth of suffering. Any clue as to which part of the truth of suffering? It's inanimate. That's a little bit of a clue. So suffering, there's suffering, change, suffering, condition.
Condition.
Yes. Okay. So then here it says, in relation to the world that is made up of sentient beings, the Lord here is Bhagavan, so that's a term of referring to the Buddha. Bhagavan declared, "O bhikshus, I see with my pure divine eye, which transcends out of humans, beings who are passing away and being reborn," and so on. This is a quote that appears in many sutras. After the disintegration of their body, those beings who possess good deeds are born in the happy states and the celestial realms among the gods. So this particular passage, if you see the footnote, this represents a description that is identified as referring to one of the Buddha's 10 powers, right? So a Buddha is one of the unique qualities of a Buddha is that the Buddha possesses the so-called 10 powers, Dashabala. And this one is called then Chipo Naigya Kimbeto, right? That the Buddha can see with his eye, with his wisdom eye, right? That how and where different sentient beings are passing away, and once they've passed away, then how the karma that they possess determines where they are reborn subsequent to their death. So, this is death is kind of the most radical form of impermanence, right? Typically in the Lamrim, when we talk about impermanence, we talk about reflecting on our mortality. So here, when this passage is quoted, it's meant to be recognized as the Buddha describing how he perceives the impermanence of all beings in the form of their their death and their subsequent rebirth. So that's a scriptural passage that relates to sentient beings. Okay, so it says, with this formulation, the Lord, the one who possessed of supreme vision, the one who sees everything directly, has declared the impermanence of the world that is made up of sentient beings. Okay, so those two scriptural passages. Okay, then the next passage is the world that is a receptacle, meaning the inanimate world. And this is a sutra. This is a reference to the sutra on the 7 suns, which is the one that I sent to you. So this, I don't believe that this is translated into the Tibetan Kangyur, for instance. The Kangyur has a certain amount of sutras that can be identified with Hinayana canon, but not very many, to be honest, and not in a very systematic way, right? So there are various collections of sutras in the Hinayana canon. One of them is called, in Tibet, it's called Chigle Trebe Lung. Chigle Trebe Lung is Anguttara Nikaya. In Tibetan, or in Sanskrit, they call it Ekotara Nikaya. Eko means one. Ekotara means and. So it's a sutras that are classified according to identifying certain numbers of things. And so this is the Sutra on the 7 Suns, is in the section of that collection that deals with 7s. Okay, things that are described in terms of 7. And so this is a sutra which describes the end of the world, the destruction of the world with the arising of 7 suns. in the universe, right?
Mm.
Okay, so this is a famous sutra. For instance, in there's a reference to it in Nagarjuna's letter, right? Nagarjuna wrote two short treatises that were considered to have been like they're poems, but they were sent, or they were thought of as having been sent to a particular king as instruction in the form of a letter. So one of them is called Shi Jing, and in that he talks about that it's actually a reference to our own impermanence, but he is alluding to the Sutra of the Seven Suns. He says, if this entire external world is something that at some point in cosmic time is going to be, disintegrated to the point where nothing, not even ashes, remain, then needless to say, we humans, who are by comparison very fragile, are going to, we should recognize that we too are, transient, right? So that's a not a very, a very, what should I say? It doesn't. He only makes a passing reference to this doctrine or this sutra. Anyway, I sent Andy a translation, English translation of this sutra. So anybody that I don't know, you're just going to send it to everybody?
I already did.
Oh, okay. So you
Should
can read it. It's interesting. This is something that's well known in all Buddhist traditions, and it's referred to. In Buddhist cosmology, for instance. So he says, there will come an occasion after the passage of a long period of time when seven suns will arise successively in the world. And the passage of this world that is a receptacle and that has been consumed by fire and reduced to cinder with the great earth, Sumeru, the king of mountains, and everything else up to the world of Brahman. Not even soot will be perceived. Not even the remnants of ashes will be perceived. With this formulation, the Lord, the one who is possessed of supreme vision, the one who sees everything directly, has declared the impermanence of the enduring world that is a receptacle. Okay, so this section so far is a reference to trustworthy scriptural statements, and then the meditation practitioner is supposed to say to himself or herself, the Buddha has said this. The Buddha is the all-knowing one. So I may not appreciate it, I may not be aware of it, but I believe that everything is impermanent. And so he says, the meditation practitioner gains a conviction about the impermanence of all conditioned things that is governed by faith. Okay, the faith in the authority of the Buddha's word. Okay, now one of the things I think that I don't know if this really strikes you as of any consequence or not. I think one of the things that particularly this last passage is meant to sort of bring to your attention is that you're supposed to not just read the passage and pay lip service to it and say, oh yes, that's what the Buddha said, but you're supposed to contemplate everything that I see, all the mountains, all the buildings, all the things that seem so solid and so enduring. At some point in the distant future, they are going to disappear. They are going to be non-existent. And so, that's supposed to sort of kind of begin to, sort of awaken in you some sense of, impermanence, in that sort of, basic way. At any rate, so that's how this meditation is meant to begin. So you're to bring to mind these sorts of passages. Here there were 3 examples that were given that relate to the idea of impermanence, and that's sort of how you start your practice. Okay. Okay. So remember that's the first of the forms of authoritative knowledge, right? The scriptural treatise. And then, okay, so now the next one is now investigating permanence on the basis of directly observable experience. And this is really, to me, what I found to be really quite, I don't know. To me, it was striking. It's an exercise. It's a sequential exercise that the meditator undertakes, which sort of examines all elements of experience, both the inanimate world and you yourself as a living being and other living beings, and sort of in a kind of methodical way, you review in your mind how everything is subject to change. Okay, and so it's done in this way that is understood to not leave out anything. And I think what it's meant to sort of instill in you is the idea that nothing is not changing. Everything is constantly changing in one way or another, and sort of to reinforce that idea in your head. And that's that. Okay, this is now the form of reflection that's based on direct experience. Okay, where you can observe, and then from that, then you make the inference to subtle impermanence. So this is kind of an essential. This is kind of the foundation for making that ultimate inference. Okay, so I guess we're not going to have a lot of time, and this is going to be it. Just this one day, we're going to read this text. Okay, so what I want to do is introduce you to enough of it that you can then go over it on your own. So let's see, because he introduces this next section, which is pretty lengthy. And he says, after having gained this conviction that is governed by faith, referring to scriptures, the meditation practitioner repeatedly investigates a form of impermanence that is directly evident. And that directly evident means he's talking about the fact that things are always kind of in a state of flux, in a state of change. That is not beyond the range of sight. It means it's directly observable. And that does not depend upon others. That's the crucial point. That does not depend on others it's important because it means you're not supposed to take somebody else's word for it. You're supposed to review all the descriptions that are given here and confirm them for yourself based on your own experience and say, this is what it says. Yes, I agree. I confirm. I concur by my own observation that what this is saying is true. And that's what this exercise consists of. I found this to be quite, I mean, not, it's not like, how should I say? I mean, it's just something that I think that if you do go through it, I think it does have an effect on you. It does sort of put you in a frame of mind to where you sort of want to become more aware of how much change is going on around you that you don't necessarily notice or you don't necessarily, place much importance on it. And so this is saying, basically notice it. It's going on all the time. Okay. So then it says, how does he or she carry out this investigation? He or she makes a classification about two types of objects, inner objects and outer objects. Okay, outer objects are the external world. Okay, so he says outer objects are those of 16. Inner objects are the 6 inner bases. Okay, so This is a term that has more, I think, more significance than I think we often recognize. The six bases are the six of the 12 ayatanas, right? The ayatanas is this Abhidharma term that refers to the literally like the doors for the arising of consciousness. That's how they're described. So the doors for the arising of consciousness are their outer doors and their inner doors. The outer doors are objects that we engage with our faculties, and the inner doors are the faculties themselves. And when these two things interact, then consciousness arises. Okay. So here it's talking about the six inner bases are the eye faculty, ear faculty, nose faculty, tongue faculty, body faculty, and mind faculty. And it's interesting this is now yoga. We're talking about yogacaras now, right? In yogacara school, in particular, I don't know that if it's exclusive to them, but in Asanga, for instance, he talks about the Rik. He talks about spiritual lineage as an attribute of the six inner bases. So why does he say that? And one of the things that he's saying is that these faculties are the agents of perception. Right? When we say we see things with our eye. We hear things with our ear. And so, in a way, they are the agents of these forms of perception. And so, without giving it more importance, but there are also descriptions in which they describe a person or these six elements as being the foundation of a sentient being. So, if we want to talk about a sentient being in terms of a functioning animate, organism, it's in terms of what is the acts of perception that take place through the faculties. So the faculties are sort of a fundamental element of our being as functioning, animate, sentient beings. So there's that significance to like using this the term the six inner bases as referring to the inner objects, right? Okay, so but he starts out here with the outer objects in terms of 16 categories, okay? And so this is kind of a range of elements that we encounter in our everyday life that are meant to be sort of all inclusive of what aspects of the external world we come in contact with. So he mentions here, right, objects that relate to the earth, right? There's these things talk about villages, towns, houses, markets, and the like. So, for you, that would be New York City, would be that aspect of it. And objects that relate to places that bring delight. And then he talks about, trees, and this is the natural world of trees, grasses, herbaceous plants, large trees in the forest, and the like. Okay, so the first category is man-made, part of the man-made environment. Second category is part of the natural environment, okay? Then the third category is objects that relate to mountains, right? That objects, so that these are all part of what are associated with the element earth, solid things, right? And then number 4 is water. These are then associated with the element of water. It's 4 elements, right? Fourth one is bodies of water, springs, lakes, ponds, rivers, oceans, and so on. Then fifth one is objects related to agriculture, such as fields and just, I guess, economy in the time of the Buddha and ancient society. Agriculture was the kind of basis of economy. Objects that relate to storage, certain kinds of depositories, objects that are forms of food, so part of our daily life, we eat every day. Objects that are forms to drink, and We have things that we imbibe, objects that are vehicles, whether they be animals or whether they be carts and the like. Objects that are clothing, things that we wear, objects that are ornamental in nature, that would be jewelry and so forth. Then this is kind of more, what should I say, sort of for entertainment, objects that relate to acting, dancing, singing, instrumental music, objects that are fragrances, flowers, garlands, objects that are household implements and utensils, that's, chairs, tables, pots and pans, objects that relate to light and darkness. That's an interesting category, I guess. I think that relates to just things that like at nighttime we need to have light to illuminate. Then the last one is objects used by men and women in pursuit of pleasure. That's just acknowledging the fact that part of our life involves elements that relate to sexual activity, I suppose. And so this is a category of things. Now what it does is, so now here he lists categories of things, okay, that can be reflected on. And then these are outer objects. And then the next section, the next point that he makes, what he's doing here is he's giving the parameters that you need to engage in this exercise of direct observation of change. So first he gives you the categories relating to the external world, the elements of our daily life and elements of our environment. In the next category here, he says 15 types of change that relate to inner objects. Okay, now so this is talking about living beings. Okay, so here these are things that are observable in our lives. Okay, so number one, right? What are the 15 types of change that relate to inner objects? Number one is the most basic thing, is the changes caused by the stages of life. Okay, so the fact that we're born, we're an infant, we're a child, we're an adolescent, an adult, a young adult, a mature person, an old person, and then eventually we die. So, but that's a process of change that we all undergo. Then the change that is caused by complexion. So this is kind of talking about our appearance. That in the different seasons, for instance, when we're exposed to cold, when we're exposed to heat, then our physical appearance can change. Changes that are caused by shape. These are things like either gain in weight or loss in weight. Your body shape changes. Change caused by success and failure. Then the change caused by having limbs and minor appendages become complete. So, we're subject to injury, and due to that injury, we can lose some of our limbs or fingers or even arms, legs. The change caused by injury inflicted by another person. Change caused by heat and cold. All right, I think you get it, the picture. All right, so this is the category. Then towards the end of this, number 12 is illness, number 13 is death, and then number 14 and 15 are kind of the ultimate impermanence, where the corpse begins to disintegrate and then ultimately turns into dust. Okay, so these are different types of change that relate to living beings. So far, he's just setting up categories for contemplation. Then the next one is causes of change. Okay, so here there are 8 causes of change. Then passage of time, violence, which is inflicted by some person on to another. Then enjoyments, changes of the seasons. These apply, I think, not just to inner beings, but also outer as well. Okay, for instance, being burned by fires, it can be, conflagration, a forest fire, or a building burning down. Being made wet by water can refer to floods and the like. Being dried by the wind can be the effect of strong wind. And then there's this last category is different conditions and kind of, I think it's kind of a catch-all. Okay, so then now here he describes, from here, he lists the 8 and then he describes what they mean, right? So it's pretty straightforward. So let's look at the last one. Encountering a different condition means, so this is talking about largely experience. This is inner sentient being's experience. This is page, my page 8. There should be a number 8. Encountering a different condition means, for example, for a person who's experiencing a pleasurable feeling that arose on the basis of a form of contact that leads to a pleasurable experience, to encounter a form of contact. This is a reference to Buddhist theory of cognition. Actually, it's present in I think it's present in the 12 limbs of dependent origination, right? So rekpa is contact, right? Rekpa doesn't mean physical contact. Rekpa is actually a mental factor. Rekpa is one of the semjons. And rekpa is really more like the mind's. There's a here, it's in here. So this book has in the back of it a description of the 5 skandhas. Right? So rekpa, contact, is one of the 5 most basic mental factors, right? And it says it's in the formations, right? Contact. So the kind of the aphorism in Vaishnava text is the determination that occurs upon the convergence of 3 is called rekpa. So it's kind of a fixing of the mind in such a way that a particular kind of perception will follow. And in particular, the perception will have a qualitative aspect to it. So the contact is what determines the nature of the feeling that will accompany that perception. So rekpa is kind of a precursor for tsorwa, right? So it doesn't say that here, but in the literature, for instance, here he does say that. He says a person who's experiencing a pleasurable feeling, right? So that is dewe tsorwa, right? Dewe tsorwa that arose on the basis of a form of contact that leads to a pleasurable experience. So it's saying what determined that particular tsorwa is pleasurable. What determined it is the nature of the contact that preceded that perceptual cognitive state. So that sort of governs what kind of tsorwa will arise in its wake. So that's kind of what's implied by that language. So it says a particular pleasurable feeling that arose from a contact that leads to a pleasurable feeling then is supplanted by, or it says someone encounters a form of contact that will lead to a painful experience. So it's saying that's a different condition. So it's saying you're experiencing some kind of pleasurable feeling, and then subsequent to that, then a new form of contact occurs in your mind, and that contact is going to lead to a painful experience. So that contact is the condition that determines a different experiential state like that, okay? And then he reverses it. He says, if you're experiencing a painful condition, then that can be replaced by a form of contact that will lead to pleasurable. And then the third type is the one which is neither pleasurable nor painful. So this is what this category is. Then he says, that's one type of another condition. It's another one. The point of this category is that relates to things that are mental in nature. A person who's overcome by attachment, right? Someone who is in a state of attachment, right? Then another condition comes along that causes that person to become angry, right? So some other condition occurred which replaced that attachment with anger. So then this other condition is then what's being then addressed here. This is a person who's overcome by attachment to encounter a cause for developing anger. And because of that encounter, the perturbation, that's a technical term for mental affliction, of attachment will disappear, and the perturbation, that's gunetiva. Gunti is this Abhidharmic term for one of the mental afflictions. Hatred will arise. So there are conditions that we meet with that cause our emotional states to change from attachment to hatred and the opposite. Okay? So that's one. So one was the qualitative element of our experience can change, fluctuate. The other is our emotional state can fluctuate based on the conditions that we encounter. And then different kinds of experiences can change our sensory experience from, attending to sound, to attending to things that we see, attending to things that we smell, and so on. This is our sensory experience, right? So it's saying these are this last category of causes of change are the conditions that cause a fluctuation in our mental state. Okay, so those are the 8 description of the 8 kinds of change. Okay, right. Let's see. Okay, so the causes of change, and then the category of outer objects, and then I think now we go to the first change. Okay, so let's see. The inner objects were, where are we here? We had 16 outer objects and then 15 types of inner object, right?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, so we're going to start with those, now the 15 types of change that relate to inner objects. Okay, so now he goes through each one of these, and we're meant to reflect on them one by one, right? So there's 15. And then following that, he goes through the same process with the 16 categories of outer objects, okay? Yeah. Okay, so it's 2:30. Let's see if we can get basically through this section here by just looking at a few examples. So starting with the 15 categories that relate to inner kinds of change, right? Okay, so this is like when you go to your aunt and uncle's house or your grandparents' house and you see the little kids and you say, "Oh, look how you've changed. You've gotten so big." That's change in the stages of life, right? That's something that's familiar to all of us, right? So how does a meditation practitioner investigate the impermanence of change that is caused by stages of life that occurs in relation to inner objects? Okay, so it's just a question to introduce the first category. So Here, the meditation practitioner observes in relation to himself or in relation to others the stages of life that begin with youth and continuing up to old age. Having seen the gradual variation and uninterrupted change in the continuum of conditioned entities, he or she should then reflect. Okay, so this is kind of the exercise. Now, this is the exercise itself. Okay, so you sort of you take yourself as an example, and you can look back at your life and think of what your life was like when you were walking around in shorts, right, as a little kid, and going to school, and and all the things that you experienced up to now. And then you can do the same thing for family members or other people that you know. And then this is sort of the act of confirming the exercise. It's quoted here. Having seen the gradual variation and uninterrupted change in the continuum of conditioned entities, he or she should then reflect, quote, how remarkable is the impermanence of these conditioned entities. This gradual transformation that they undergo is plainly evident. And so I kind of acknowledge it. I recognize it, and you're supposed to have it's supposed to be something that kind of strikes you in a moving sort of way, like, wow, how much I've changed, right? I don't see the change, minute to minute, but it's there, and I'm now sort of making note of it to myself, right? How remarkable this is. Okay, so this is the first exercise, right? And then it goes through all of these things. Each category, they're not hard to comprehend. They're pretty straightforward. The whole point of this is that they're observable. And the other thing is that they're meant to be done, in a sequential manner to sort of take in all elements of your experience in your life, and then come to this conclusion that everything is always in a state of change, whether I recognize it or not. And so this exercise is supposed to help you to recognize it. Okay, so there's that. Okay, so let's take one example from the outer objects, right? So if we flip through to the outer objects, right, okay, so here's the first one. Outer objects that relate to the earth. The impermanence of change relates to the outer objects that relate to the earth. Yeah? You got it?
I didn't find it, no.
You got to scroll a bit.
You're a few ahead.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, page
I better.
9 of
Is
the
it?
English.
Yeah?
Yeah, please run.
Okay. So it says, then, after having investigated inner objects in this way, meditation practitioner investigates the impermanence of change that relates to the 16 types of outer objects, right? Okay, so now he says, this is one that this one really struck me. I've made reference to this before. And those of you who have been to Howell, right? If you've ridden on the bus, the main route is Route 9, right? You get off the Parkway and you come down Route 9. So in the 40 plus years that I've lived in Howell, going up and down Route 9, this is what I see, this is what I notice. And as I get older, I notice it more and more. So he says, in places where previously no constructed buildings in the form of houses, markets, almshouses, temples, and monasteries had been visible, right? There was a time when central New Jersey was very agricultural, right? There were, if anything, there were farms, nothing more, right? He or she sees at a later time constructed buildings that are new. Oh, look, so-and-so put up this strip mall, going up down Route 9, that are new, that are well made and well plastered, right? So you notice the, appearance of, physical structures where there weren't any before. And then at a later time, you notice if you're there in that same area for a long enough time, you notice that these very same buildings, before long, also see that they have become decayed, old, damaged, and deteriorating, rotting, collapsed, completely broken down, sometimes burned by fire, sometimes washed away by flood, and so forth. I was recently on a trip, as some of you know, and this struck me. I don't know if I mentioned it to Bali. We were in London, and it is not unique to London, but we did a lot of walking. We did it. We were, taking subways and things, and we'd be out in the street, we'd be walking about, and I'm looking up, and I'm seeing, London's an old city, and I'm seeing all of these, cranes and these, construction type projects that are working on these old buildings. And this thought popped into my head. I was saying, what is this? This is a sign where they're trying to, fight impermanence. They're trying to, keep impermanence at bay by, holding these buildings together or keeping them sort of in shape. It was kind of, I sort of, I'm saying it sort of tongue in cheek, but I really did have that sort of reaction to it. That, and how you always do walking around New York City, they're always kind of like trying to fix, whatever, water pipes or mains or something, or digging up the streets, try to restore or keep things from falling apart. Okay, so then it says, so you here it makes 2 points. One is, noticing, the construction of new man-made, structures that were not there previously, and then in a later time noticing maybe not even the same ones, it would be other ones that after a while, they start to deteriorate and they don't look so good. Another example, right? Archaeological remains, right? What is the poem? The poem Ozymandias?
Oh yeah.
That's that's impermanence, right? That's what it's saying.
Behold you my works in despair, I think is how it is.
Yeah. Okay. So then it's saying, having seen this, he or she should reflect. How remarkable is the impermanence of these conditioned entities? So this is sort of a refrain for each one of these things. You're supposed to, take note of this different kinds of observable change and say, oh, this is really noteworthy. This is really, this kind of stuff is going on all the time. Either, new man-made things are appearing here and there, right? What is it in where all the oil money in the Middle East is building all these wonderful cities like Abu Dhabi and these out in the water, they're building these
Man-made islands.
yeah, right, stuff like that, right? So that's that's remarkable, right? And yeah, so this is one example. So this is the way in which a meditation practitioner investigates the impermanence in relation to the earth. So that's one example. All right, so I'm not going to go through them. There are 16 categories here that are the outer objects, right? And then okay. So then, I don't know, can you find this this is now at the end of this. So now, so there are 16 categories of outer things, 15 categories of inner things whose change is meant to be reflected on. And then there's 8 causes of change that relate to both of them, right? Okay, so you get to the end of this. So he says, scroll down to, let's see, there's no heading here. This is the manner in which the meditation practitioner investigates the impermanence of change undergone by inner and outer objects according to the appropriate circumstances on the basis of the 8 causes of change that were described earlier, using a form of attention that relates to what is directly evident.
It's page 11.
Yeah?
In English, it's page 11. It's the
Yeah.
last paragraph.
Right? Okay. Here, he or she should investigate and develop a conviction about them. So the point of this is to take note of this, all this observable change, and saying, again, that was in the beginning. There was a statement that said that it should not be based on others, meaning that you should not just sort of take somebody else's word for it. This is something that you should use your own, reflective powers to confirm for yourself. So here he uses it again, right? He says, he or she should investigate and develop a conviction about them, recalling in just this way the manner in which the impermanence of change is seen and experienced by him or her on the basis of direct perception. In other words, you yourself have to, confirm this for yourself, and in a way that does not depend on another person, right? All right. So this is something that you have to. You do it subjectively, and you do it privately. You do it for yourself. It doesn't depend on another person. Doesn't come about without having been brought into being by somebody else. So this is not that somebody else sort of told you how to do this, but rather you did it yourself, and you came to this, conclusion on your own. This is why it's called a form of attention that relates to what is directly evident. Okay, so I don't know if it came through. I mean, if you read through each one of these things carefully and just slowly on your own, you'll see that it's meant to kind of be an all-inclusive kind of exercise. And at the end, you should be left with this idea that everything is, to one degree or another, to some extent observable. That everything is always changing. Physical things, not only physical things, mental things, not only mental things, my own, body, my own living body is something which is not staying the same. Okay. Okay. Now we're going to make the transition from directly observable to an inference. And this inference is the inference of subtle impermanence. Okay, and so this is the one where this is not necessarily meant to bring you some kind of epiphany, but the language is takes you through a process that's meant to you draw the conclusion that the only way this could be possible is if things are changing from moment to moment. So how do they make that? How's that inference drawn? Okay, so now we're making this switch. Having examined this in this way, the impermanence of change, using a means of reflection that is based upon direct observation. Okay, that's this whole process that you've done. The practitioner does not recognize that the existence and presence of physical conditioned entities is characterized by a state of disintegration in which those entities arise and pass away each moment. Okay, you don't see that. Okay, subtle impermanence is not an object of the sense of the physical senses. You cannot see subtle impermanence. Even the yogic, even at the level, there is a level of direct perception in which you quote perceive subtle impermanence, and that's not at the level of sensory perception. That's the yiking oneself. All right, so that means there munsum, right? The munsum is direct perception. Munsum tema, right, is the form of direct perception that is valid cognition, right? When your senses are not impaired and you perceive colors and sounds and so on, those are forms of valid direct perception, okay? Then there's another form of direct perception, right? That is Nenjormunsum, right? Nenjormunsum is yogic direct perception, right? Yogic direct perception is what you attain when you achieve, for example, when you achieve the direct perception of emptiness, right? So there is also a direct perception of subtle impermanence, right? And that is something that is perceived by mind consciousness, right? It's a mental object that is, in some sense, a form of, we don't think of it, direct perception, as something other than, usually we think of it as our senses, but this is talking about a form of direct perception that is mental in nature, okay? So the inferential awareness in which you correctly gain a certain understanding of subtle impermanence, that's not Nenjo Munsu, right? That's not yogic direct perception. That's inference, right? And that inferential understanding has to become the object of one-pointed meditation. Then it has to be subjected to vipassana, and then ultimately it can culminate in a form of direct perception, direct mental perception, okay? At no point in that process do you begin to see subtle impermanence with your eyes or hear it with your ears, okay? Okay, but anyway, it says, concerning this matter, right, he or she should make an inference that is based upon the means of reflection that relies on direct observation, okay? So that exercise of direct observation is what you use as a basis for drawing the inference, right? For instance, there is Muatop Jepak, right? Muatop Jepak. Jepak means anumana, means inference, right? Muatop Shupki Jepak, right? What we normally think of as inference is an inference that we draw on the basis of what is presumably justifiable in terms of causation that's observable in the physical world, for instance, right? We understand that, the classic idea, where there's smoke, there's fire, right? So if you see smoke, that's the result of fire, so you can infer the fire, even though the fire is not visible, on the basis of perceiving the smoke with your... So that kind of inference is based on the nature of Ngobotobshuk, right? On the nature of understanding the natural world and the causal relationships that occur there. So what we're talking about here is that kind of inference. And the observable world is this, what we've just sort of, the process of reflection we just engaged in, where we presumably came to the understanding that nowhere in the physical world or in the world of living beings is there any element of our experience which is not constantly undergoing some kind of observable change, right? Directly observable change. So that is this kind of the necessary sort of understanding that allows you to draw this inference. Okay, so here it says, he should make an inference that is based upon the means of reflection that relies on direct observation, and he should form this inference in the following manner. Okay, so now this is the kind of the key description. The change that these conditioned entities undergo over time is reasonable only if they are subject to a form of disintegration in which they arise and pass away with each moment, right? So this phenomenon is not reasonable if entities remain in an unchanging state. Okay, so those two things are mutually exclusive. I have some water. Huh? Okay. So that's kind of a what should I say? Kind of the flip side of the observation that everything is always if everything is always in a state of change, then kind of the the contradictory of change is stability, absence of change, right? So it's saying nothing in our in our observable experience suggests that things ever remain unchanged. Everything in our observable experience suggests that everything is constantly changing. Okay? Okay? It's this phenomenon, right? This phenomenon of everything being ultimately changing, whether we observe it or whether we take note of it or not, would not be reasonable if entities remained in an unchanging state. What that's really implying is it's saying there's nothing in our observable experience that we can point to and say, here's an example of something which doesn't change. Okay? Therefore, while momentary conditioned entities come into being, now here, this is Buddhist theory of causation, okay? Momentary conditioned entities, now that's already assuming that things are momentary, but it's saying, when things come into being, that they come into being when certain specific conditions are present, right? I think there are rules of causation which govern the arising of things. Things, when this occurs, that will arise. When that's present, this will come into being. Those kind of formulations. So it's saying conditions determine the arising of things, right? Conditions other than the entities themselves, namely their causes, right? Nevertheless, then this is kind of the linchpin of the Buddhist doctrine of impermanence. Those entities that have arisen disintegrate of their own accord and independently of some other cause that brings about their destruction. So this is the essence of the Buddhist theory of subtle impermanence. So saying things do not depend, that the change that we observe, that things undergo, does not depend on something else impinging on entities to bring about that change. That change is something that things undergo naturally. Okay. Okay, so he says, so now he says, well, wait a minute. Didn't you say before that there were 8 causes of change? Were those not external conditions? Okay, so he addresses that. He says, moreover, the 8 causes of change initiate the arising of an alteration, a modification, a change in form, and serve as causes for the arising of a modification, right? But they do not serve as causes for the destruction of entities. Okay? Why? It is because what is perceived is the dissimilar aspects of a continuous series that is made up of conditioned entities that have undergone destruction. So it says the observable change that we can notice is not impermanence in the sense of subtle impermanence. It's just the fact that the continuum of the series of entities undergoes a kind of modification to such a degree that we recognize a different form, a different appearance to things. And that's he's describing here. Observable change is dissimilar aspects of a continuous series that is made up of conditioned entities that actually are undergoing momentary destruction and that are accompanied by the causes of it. What is that? Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. So that second line, that are accompanied by the causes of their destruction, is referring to the inherent nature of entities, which is the causes of their destruction are built into things when they come into being. So when they come into being in such a way that they will undergo destruction of their own accord, like that. Okay. So anyway, this is kind of the crux of how you draw this inference of subtle impermanence. Now here he makes a few other points talking about because okay, this is basically the end of it. So he says this is a final thing here. He's talking about how the continuum of momentary entities can disappear or give the appearance of disappearing. For instance, you boil water, right? The water will evaporate, and the water will be gone. So he says, with regard to situations in which a complete and total cessation of conditioned entities is observed, this is when we think of, he says, such as the complete and total disappearance that ultimately occurs when conditioned entities in liquid form are boiled, or the circumstances in which those conditioned entities that make up the physical world are consumed by fire at the end of a great kalpa. So at the end of a great kalpa, some aspect of the world, in some aspect, some area of the universe, are destroyed by fire, then those physical worlds will disappear completely. Because that's the second example. So he says, their ultimate, complete, and total annihilation is a case where the successive causes necessary for their continued appearance have become exhausted. It is not the case that their disappearance is caused by fire alone. So this actually also applies to, in a certain way, to arhats. Following the end of their, final life, at the end of their life, then they will not be reborn. So again, why is it they're not reborn? Because the causes that would necessitate their rebirth in a future life no longer are present, and so the continuum of their 5 heaps comes to an end. Yeah, which is the final statement. So therefore, the nature of the 8 causes of change is as was described above, while the momentary destruction of conditioned entities is a condition that they undergo of their own accord. Okay, so this is basically the description of the meditation that represents this Tebedrube Rikpa, right? This form of examination in which you use reasoning to establish subtle impermanence. And then the rest of the section here are sort of kind of how should I describe them? They are kind of relate to karma and past lives and future lives. So it talks about here he says, how is it that certain sentient beings are attractive and certain sentient beings are not as attractive? How is it that on those opposites there's a variation in the nature of lives, that some people are have a excellent life and live in easy circumstances, and others are poor and are suffering. He says, why do some people live a long life, some people live a short life? Why does talking about sort of the variations in types of sentient beings? And he says, this diversity is reasonable only if there is a diversity of karma. So it draws into this examination that, in addition to, coming to this conclusion about subtle impermanence, then we should introduce, elements of Buddhist doctrine that relates to past lives and future lives and karma. Okay, so that's that one. Then he makes a reference to non-Buddhist idea of a divine creator, and he says that we shouldn't resort to make some of the classic objections to the doctrine of a divine creator. Why that's not a reasonable view about the origin of the world, for instance, which is it's found in a variety of forms in Buddhist literature. So he talks about that for a while. Okay, and then it concludes here to say, in this way, the meditation practitioner investigates impermanence using three types of reflection. One is based on faith, that's the scriptural authority. One is based on direct observation, and one is based on inference. So that is, let's see, among the five, that is, let's see what I see here. First part. Oh, here. So the aspect of change and the aspect of perishability are the first two. So the aspect of change was mainly the observable change. The aspect of perishability was then the inference that you draw, that the only way that this can be explained is if things, the nature of things is that when they come into being, the seeds of their destruction are part of their nature, and therefore, since they don't require anything else for them to cause their destruction, therefore their destruction is immediate. That's kind of the basic description of the doctrine of subtle impermanence. Okay, so then there are three more parts to the discussion of impermanence. One is, let's see. All right, well, this starts out. So regarding this topic, the 5 forms of impermanence, there are 5 corresponding forms of meditation that have been described above. Represent an explanation of the aspect of change and the aspect of perishability. That's what I just said. Then he says, what about separation? So now this is, let's see. This is another kind of impermanence to reflect on. This is it's referred to as a form of impermanence that is described as a kind of separation. So, okay, so this is the first one is saying here. People, this is sometimes in the Lamrim. This is Tomen du Guru Dunga. Tomen du Guru Dunga means then the suffering of falling from a high position to a low position. Then, so it's saying that even if we achieve a certain kind of prosperity, even if we achieve a certain kind of high status, right? That those are inherently then untrustworthy. That they will not last. That inevitably that will be we will lose that status. So it's a kind of impermanence meant to overcome attachment. So it's saying certain persons at an earlier time were lords of others. They were not a servant, not a minion, not someone's laborer. They had freedom to act however they saw fit. Then in the later time, they lose that status, their state of being free from servitude, and they take on the condition of being the servant of others and becoming deprived of their status as Lord. So that's saying that that can be interpreted within one lifetime or between 2 different lifetimes, right? So this is also a form of impermanence to contemplate. This is referred to as the impermanence of separation. So the same thing it says also relates to wealth. Wealth is not something that is then something that we can rely on. That wealth can be depleted or lost, can be stolen, can be squandered, and so forth. So that's a kind of impermanence, right, to reflect on. Yeah. So that brings to there's a really beautiful term. It's called it's not often. I don't see it so much in Tibetan literature, but I think it's a Buddhist principle that is that exists and ought to be ought to be followed, ought to be adhered to. So here's where it comes. There's reference to it. Among the okay. So this is Serena. Serena is one of the 20 secondary mental afflictions, right? Serena means stinginess. Right? It's kind of the opposite of generosity, right? So here he describes, let's see, where is it? It comes in this, so this is the 20 secondary mental afflictions are in the fourth skandha, right? In the samskara skandha. This brings up another subject. So, there is a so all of this comes under the general category of the Four Noble Truths, right? And so the Four Noble Truths is basically what we're kind of reading. Are the kind of the they are sort of implicit in this in the first four chapters of our Deva's text, and the nature of the Four Noble Truths is described as something that you have to kind of enter into. Right? It says the word is avatara. Actually, it's a word, right? So for instance, in the word, in the the text, Bodhicharya avatara, right? Bodhicharya avatara, the word avatar, the verb is literally it means to descend into, right? But in this is kind of a metaphorical usage, so it means that you sort of that you develop a certain knowledge in which you embody the principles of bodhisattva practice, for instance. I think that's really what the title of Sanjaya's text means. In a similar way, the Four Noble Truths are something that you have to sort of then in plain English, it means you have to gain an understanding of. So that gaining of an understanding of the Four Noble Truths enables you sort of to in a sense enter into them, to immerse yourself in them and sort of become aware of them, right? So in point of practice, there is a formulation and the path, right? We are familiar with the idea of the path in terms of the kind of the five main divisions of the path. So there are other formulations that are part of Buddhist teaching. One of them is the so-called 37 practices or 37 elements that are that promote or that are literally on the side of that are that lead towards the attainment of enlightenment. Right? Among those 37, so they're in categories. The first category is four I call them closely placed recollections, and they pertain to the five skandhas. So they go, Lu is the body. So one of the four objects of recollection is your physical being. The second one is feelings, sorwa, right? The third one is mind, mainly consciousness, mind consciousness in particular. And the fourth one is called chur or dharmas. And the fourth category of dharmas is largely so there's a connection. Sometimes I'm going to say the reflecting on the body is a way of coming to appreciate the truth of suffering. And meditating on feelings is a way to enter into an understanding of origination and how the mental fictions arise in reaction to our feelings, our chorvas, pleasure, pain. Then mind is associated with selflessness and therefore truth of cessation. And then entities is generally identified with the mental states that are non-virtuous and the mental states that are virtuous in nature. So in the fourth skandha, right, in the formulation, the classical Asanga's formulation, there are 11 virtues. There are 6 root mental afflictions, and there are 20 secondary mental afflictions. And by understanding and appreciating the non-virtuous and virtuous mental entities, it becomes more in tune with the truth of the path. Okay, so that's so those 4 practices are described as kind of the starting point for developing an understanding in an experiential way of the Four Noble Truths. So in the case, so I'm kind of, the digression here is that it's really important to learn about the virtuous states of mind and to be able to understand how they are cultivated, how they are strengthened, and how they are developed. And the same way to understand how the mental afflictions, both root and secondary mental afflictions, how they're triggered, how to, like, one of the most important things about the mental afflictions is to recognize the circumstances under which they might arise and sort of to anticipate their arising before they become full-blown in your mind. Because if you are able to anticipate, if you are able to sort of recognize that you're in a situation where you're likely to develop the mental afflictions and that they are near at hand, so to speak, that when you have that kind of awareness about your own mind and how it functions, then you're in a better position to prevent those mental afflictions from becoming more manifest. So if you can anticipate their arising just before they arise, then that is the most effective point at which to take some kind of action which can avert their arising. But if if you lost control of your mind and they become, fully manifest in your mind, then you've kind of lost the battle. And the best thing that you can do is sort of somehow kind of try to, cool yourself down or whatever, however you want to describe it, and sort of, ride out whatever it is that you're experiencing and try to live to fight another day and avoid having that happen again. So anyway, learning about your mind and sort of when you're on the verge of developing mental afflictions it's something that in the text about the mental states, that's kind of the point that's made. Yishi Gensen wrote, and in the Lojong text and even in the Lamrim, that's kind of a point which is made, which is that, anyway, so So here's this thing about, it says stinginess. What is stinginess? Stinginess is the obstacle to generosity, right? It is then let's see, where is it? The root text part gives a final statement. Yes. Oh yeah, it's an acquisitiveness of mind. Okay, so that's kind of a general understanding of what stinginess is. So the unwillingness to sort of part with some form of wealth that you may have.
Sorry, did you say inquisitiveness?
Acquisitive.
Oh, acquisitiveness.
Acquisitive. Okay, so it's like this.
Yeah, got it.
Tight-fisted, right?
Got it.
Okay. Okay, then. Okay, then so there's the mole. There is the mole of each of the mental states. Mole means their essential nature. What are their qualities? What are their essential qualities? What is when they are present in your mind, sort of what are the elements of it that identify them so that you can recognize them? Then there is another attribute of them which is given in the Abhidharma Samachaya. Abhidharma Samachaya is Asanga's kind of an abbreviated Abhidharma text. And when he describes them, he also gives their karma. It's called their karma, which means what is their action? What effect do they have on you? In terms. So usually, the action of the mental afflictions and the action of the virtuous mental states sort of gives them a significance in terms of, for sort of the mental afflictions, is how do they impede your spiritual development, right? In terms of the virtuous mental states, what do they do that is, beneficial and promotes your spiritual practice? And actually, if you think of them, they all tie into the Four Noble Truths. Either they are connected with the perpetuation of samsara, or they can be, an element that helps to, free you from samsara, like that. So that's kind of the way to understand them. So here he says this: the action of stinginess is to provide support for this. I translate this as the avoidance of simplicity. The avoidance of simplicity. It's a term because I don't know, what better word to use. So I footnoted it. So let's see. Manyumba, literally. Okay, so that's a Tibetan translation of, let's see, this is 352, right? 352, it says, samleka is the word. Samleka is the Sanskrit word. So asamleka is avoidance of simplicity. So samleka means, this is the word that I translate as simplicity, right? Mm-hmm. This is yoche nyumba. Yoche means possession, right? Nyumba means literally it's an active form of to make less or small.
To diminish.
Yeah, to make it small. Yoche nyumba means literally it means like to be able to live with few possessions. Few possessions. Okay, so that's a literal translation of it into Tibetan.
That's a beautiful translation.
Yeah. So this is my explanation of why I call it simplicity. It says, simplicity represents the virtuous principle by which an individual seeks to keep desire in check by avoiding the accumulations of possessions that are not necessary for the pursuit of a spiritual life. Okay? So it's saying, while simplicity is not entirely satisfactory as a translation of the original term, it carries a less negative connotation than words like temperance, frugality, or austerity, right? Abstinence, and the like. which all touch on this quality, either suggest puritanical self-denial or related too narrowly to the avoidance of improper indulgence in food, drink, or sexual activity. While this quality is certainly meant to be followed by monks and nuns who adhere to the twin virtues of having few desires and being satisfied with what one has, it should not be considered as exclusive to that lifestyle. This is my explanation of it, right? It's also to be distinguished from the frugality that is the adherence to economy, since that can lead easily to stinginess rather than absence of desire. Okay, so I bring this up because I'm making the point that simplicity is a virtue. It requires you to kind of to identify sort of the essentials of it's like it's not it's not self-denial. It's not like depriving yourself of things, but it's saying, limit your possessions to things that you need, that are necessities. And it's up to you to decide what necessities are, right? I mean, one person's necessity might not be another person's necessity. But the idea is, the principle is that if we limit the things that we sort of, accumulate, we will be happier. That's kind of the idea. And so it's saying that stinginess, right? It's saying the action of stinginess is to prevent you from developing that quality, which is not something that is usually, usually we think of stinginess, well, stinginess is just a person like, they hoard things, or they don't want to, share things, or they're afraid that they're going to lose everything that they have. But here, in Stirumati, which is coming from, Indian Buddhist, literary tradition, introduces this term, which I translated as simplicity, which I think is really a beautiful kind of, even a concept that, suggests something along the lines that, we can sort of be more attentive to what are the things that we really need and what are the things that we don't need, and sort of, be more willing to do away with or avoiding trying to accumulate things that we don't need. Anyway, so that what reminded me of that is this thing about the impermanence of separation, right? That wealth is not something that we can always hold on to anyway. So why should we be all that concerned about it in the first place? Why shouldn't we just be more sort of, it's kind of, it requires that we find some kind of a balance, right? That we be able to, we are responsible for our own sort of, subsistence, or at least ideally we ought to try to avoid being a ward of the state, or whatever you want to say. But anyway, I think I made my point. Okay, so that's one form of impermanence here, is talking about status and wealth are things, both of which we cannot always hang on to, even if we would like to. I'm saying you don't need to, basically. Okay. And then here's another thing that says, these are the last two. So I think once we get here, maybe we can call it a day, because we didn't take a break. So it says the impermanence that is the natural condition of things. I don't know what page you're on here, but there's a
14.
heading for it. Okay. What is the impermanence that constitutes the natural condition of things? That is to comprehend that although the impermanence of change, right, that's observable change, the impermanence of perishability, that's subtle impermanence, the impermanence of separation, right, that's the thing now that, wealth and status are not something that we can rely on as even if we have them, that we will always be able to keep them, may not be occurring at the present. It is the natural condition of things that one will become subject to them in the future. Okay, so it's saying you may be in the flower of your youth. You may be healthy. You may be strong. You may be prosperous, right? But despite the fact that you are enjoying all of those qualities that, the ordinary world thinks very highly of, you are not going to be able to always have them, right? It's saying, as it says here, you will become subject to them in the future. So it's basically saying you're not exempt from every aspect of impermanence. And the most radical of which is the Lord of Death himself, right? Coming to knock on your door. Okay, and so then one should reflect, it is the natural condition. All right, so this is the impermanence of the natural condition of things. It is the natural. So this is saying it's the nature of things to be impermanent, and even though that impermanence might not be overtly manifest to you, you may not be experiencing loss, deprivation, illness, and all the rest of it, but you are going to at one time or another in the future, and you should not, fantasize that somehow you are going to be exempt. It's a natural condition of conditions and their inevitable result to become like this in the future. Okay, so that is a point, that is a meditation sort of, idea to reflect on and to say, things might be good right now, but I shouldn't become complacent about my life, that kind of thing. Okay, then that's one meditation. These are all meditation points. Then here's the last one. Okay, the impermanence that is currently present. Okay, yeah. So this is saying that we should reflect on the fact that we are currently subject to change. We are subject to subtle impermanence, and we may, in fact, be experiencing the impermanence of separation, which was, loss of status or loss of wealth, and so that if those things are we are currently, experiencing them, then we should tell ourselves, but I'm living in permanence, or something along those lines, right? Oh, yeah. So this is basically, the last two are sort of kind of flip sides of one another. One is you're not directly experiencing, the downside of impermanence, but you should tell yourself that it's going to come to you at some point. The last one is saying, if you are experiencing, the overt forms of impermanence, kind of in the sense of, loss of status, loss of, the quote good life, that you shouldn't, become depressed by it. You should say to yourself, this is just, this is part of what it is to be a conditioned entity, and an entity that is subject to impermanence, and therefore, I should remain, keep even-mindedness about it as much as possible. That's, I think, kind of the point of that last one. Okay, so so these are this whole discussion comes under the heading of impermanence, and I think so. It's what I like about it is that it's sort of one sort of complete overview of the topic from the point of view of someone who is, at least in what should I say? It's being presented in the framework of someone who is reached the point of path of preparation and is cultivating these meditations as part of the process of becoming more aware of the nature of the Four Noble Truths. And so in this in particular is the first aspect of the Noble Truth of suffering, which is really subtle impermanence. In its, you know, in its most refined form, and then various other kinds of impermanence, such as, you know, one's mortality, ultimate mortality, and also, you know, the recognition that life's circumstances fluctuate and things like that. Okay, so we did.
That was pretty.
I've never seen an overview, you know, in such a kind of organic way of the topic as a whole, which I don't know. I think you know, I think it's, for me, it's informative. You know, it gives you a way of personalizing it, a way of trying to engage with it. You know, to some degree at least. I mean, even if you just read through this from beginning to end, and sort of, you know, it's not that hard to understand. I mean, the inference from observable change to subtle impermanence, you know, that's kind of a tough one. I can say this, that my understanding is there are some discussions of it in the Pramanavartika. I don't remember which chapter it is. I don't think it's the second chapter. It's probably in the inference chapter. Obviously, the topic of impermanence is central to Buddhism, and, you know, other non-Buddhist traditions did not adhere to it, and they, you know, kind of didn't accept it. So Dharmakirti gives, I think, some more kind of what should I say? Maybe, to be honest, I'm not really had the opportunity to study it, but that key point about things sort of coming into existence in such a way that there's nothing, they don't depend on anything else for them to cease to exist, and therefore they cease instantly. That's kind of the essence of the doctrine. So maybe Dharmakirti, you know, has something more to say in terms of the logic that is meant to try to justify that. But I don't have, I've never had the opportunity to study it. Maybe you can talk to one of your Geshe friends and ask them. I personally would, I'd be interested to, you know, to have someone explain those particular verses. I think it'd be interesting to figure it. So anyway, that's it for today, I guess. Leave it there. Okay. So, then maybe we just, I hope I didn't exhaust you without giving you the benefit of a break. That's kind of one of my, what should I say, faults is,
Hallmarks.
what's that?
Hallmarks.
Hallmarks, yeah, okay. I'll take that as a compliment. That I don't get tired when we have Dharma talks, so I don't know. Maybe you guys get tired of listening, but I don't. I find that you know, it's relaxing even. So anyway, what I said? Wow.
That's great.
So oh yeah. Okay, so we read the Ringbema. Let's see. Oh yeah. Does anybody need it? Anybody?
Yeah.
Nice. Okay, I have another version of it here.
Thank you.
Let's see. Just give me a second to find.
I'll have next week. I apologize. It's my fault.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, sure. Okay. So this is, for those of you who don't know, this is called Ringbema because the word Ring Dube is in the first line, and Tibetans often refer to their prayers by some of the first syllables in it, like Yunten Shi Gyurma is from the first line. So anyway, this is also known as Lamrim Malam. It's in these verses come from, these were, Tsongkhapa wrote them, and they're at the end of the Lamrim Chima as well. So anyway. Okay. Dani ringu bele zonini kadara yamba kanshi sabante lo ming marigi dongzhou wanam nam zhengya we wangbo da gyurjik. That verse says, may I become a Buddha. Namdring Gyawe Wangbo Dagyurjik means by the virtue that I accumulated, which consists of the two accumulations, which is as vast as space, through making effort for a long time to practice the Lamrim, then by that virtue may I become a Buddha who is a guide for all those beings who are blind because their minds are darkened by ignorance. Dharma sambe tera gunduyam jambe yangi tsewe jesune tembe rimba gunzan lam gishok nyene drube gyanam nyenje shok. Okay? We just stop after each verse. Okay? So this verse says, may I please the Buddha. Gyanam nyenje shok means may I cause the Buddhas to be pleased. Then how? During all the lifetimes that it takes me to reach becoming a Buddha, right? During that lifetime, then through being watched over by the loving kindness of Manju Gosha, may Manju Gosha be my spiritual guide, and therefore may through Manju Gosha's guidance, then may I have the opportunity to meet with, nyeva means to find, or meet with the supreme path, which includes all the elements of the teaching. It's a Lamrim path. And through practicing it, which first you have to meet with it, learn it, and then by practicing it, right, during all these lifetimes, may I please all the Buddhas. Rangi jishin tobe lamgi ne shuga zewe jangwe takegi trowe yiki mumba sejene gyawe temba yurin zingyurchi. Then, by the way, malam is not wishful thinking either. Usually they say malam means like, may this happen. It's not like, oh, wouldn't that be nice? It really means you are expressing the conviction that you make every intention to bring it about. It's that kind of prayer. Like that. Oh, yeah. So then this verse, it says, may I preserve the Buddha's teaching for a long time. Right? And the prayer is that, may I preserve the Buddha's teaching for a long time. How? Rangi jishin tope lamgi ne means then through the the elements of the path which I realized correctly, right? Jishin topa means I realized correctly. Shugat sewa means then may I use those, may I employ those key points of the path that I have properly understood. And then by very strong love or compassion, or then sewa it means in any kind of empathy towards others, right? May that then may that love enable me to bring about, or it's jangba means bring forth, right? Tabke means skillful means, which will allow me to dispel the darkness of beings' minds, right? And having done so, then it means not enough for you to learn the Dharma and practice the Dharma. If you spread the Dharma, if you teach others about the Dharma, and you enable others to learn about the Dharma, then by increasing the numbers of people who are followers of the Buddha's teaching, then that's how you will be able to preserve the Buddha's teaching, by ensuring that there are followers who continue to practice, right? Like that. Then tempa rinchen chogi magyavam jagyanyam baragurbe chodeni ninje chenpo yira gyabayi pende dende sewa jepasho. And this somewhat similar. It's may I then make this holy teaching, which is the pendetara, means the treasure of benefit and happiness. It means the Buddha's teaching, as exemplified by Lamrim tradition. May I selva means may I spread it. Selva means to make it clear, but in this case, then it means to spread it. How and where? It says. Tembe rinchen chogi machaba means temba rinchen chogi machaba means any place where the precious jewel of the teaching has not reached. Machaba means where it's not prevalent, right? Or kyabdang nyambar gyurba, where it has appeared but it is in decline. Nyambar gyurbe chok. In both of those places, Yingje Chenpo Yira Gyawei means moved by, with my mind moved by great compassion. Yingje Chenpo Yira Gyawei, Pendet and Sawa Jemusho means may I act to spread it there. Right? Seje Gyawei me Jung Jin Le Le Dru Chan Chu Lam Gi Rim Re Kyam Tandu Nam Gi Yi La Pe De Shin Gyawei Ze Ba Ring Du Kyong Gyu Shi. Now this is saying that may your activities serve to extend the Buddha's enlightened activities, right? Gyawei Zeva means Buddha's activities. Ringdu Kyongba means may you help to promote widely the Buddha's activities. Then how? Seje Gyawei Mejum Chinle Le Lektruk Chandulam Girimba means then this is saying that Chandulam Girimba means this doctrine, this teaching, which Atisha brought to Tibet. Lamrim teaching. Then where did it come from? It was created by the activities, the marvelous activities of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Buddha's main teacher, and then a great lineage masters of Bodhisattvas who helped to establish the tradition. Right? Seje means together with the Buddha's offspring. Right? Gyawei Menju means marvelous or extraordinary. Chinle means their activities. Mainly is Sung Chinle, teaching activities. Lekdruk means created or produced the Lamrim tradition. Then through the Lamrim tradition, then with this Lamrim tradition, the instrumental, right, by means of the Lamrim tradition, Kandan Namki Yila Pelter means may then those who are seekers of liberation, Kandan Namki Yi means may their minds be and become endowed with splendor, right? Splendor of the Dharma's knowledge, right? And and then may I also help to spread the Lamrim teaching, right? Far and wide. Lao San Zhu Bei Tun Gen Zhu Jie Jing Ge Gen Se Che Mi Dan Mi Min Kun Sera Kun Du Gya We Na Ba Yi Nam Da Lang Dan Dra War Ma Yu Ji. Oh yeah, then it's like it's implied all your future lives. Then may I never be separated from Namdaklam. Namdaklam means the pure path, right? The pure path which the Buddhas have praised. That means the path which taught in the Mahayana generally and Lamrim in particular. Then Tsirakuntu means in all my future lives, right? Then there's a Lamsan Drube Twingen Drupje Jing. Again, said Mida Mimin Kun means, especially it means, then Mida Mimin Kun means not only you, but Lamsan Drube Twingen Drupje Jing. Again, Seje means then these are the ones who are helping to establish the conditions that are favorable to practice of Dharma. Then that could be like benefactors. Right? And the benefactors are the ones who support the Dharma and the Sangha. Right? Then those are Lamsan Drube, Dunkin, Drup Jeching, they create those Twingen means favorable conditions. Gehen Seche, and they dispel the unfavorable conditions. Then Mida Miminkun means human beings, but also non-human beings. Then it means like Dharma protectors or other spiritual beings. Then may they, may they not be separated from the path. Then Kang Se Te Ba Cho La Jun Ju Su Jin Tru La Zamba De Ze Tun Den Nam Ki Ta Tu Ro Che Jing Ja Shi Ga Tsu Cho Kun Kya Gyu Ji. And that is last one is then through then this is for yourself. Kangze means when I, or during the time that during the time that I'm practicing Tsushin, means properly as I should, practicing and making effort to practice. Ju means in the 6 kinds of activities. They're described different ways. I think in the Namdro Lachan, in the translation I give, you can find a listing of what these are. These are like, copying scriptures, teaching others. These are, Ju means there are 10 classical Dharma activities. Then Tegwa Chogla means carrying out these 10 activities in relation to the supreme vehicle, then Mahayana, right? Then as I'm striving to practice these 10 activities, then Tunden Namkin, Tunden means then the powerful ones. Then these are like Dharma protectors. Tunden Namki Tatu Drojechi means may they assist me, means may they help me as I strive to carry out these 10 activities. And finally, Jashi Gyatso means then it may every kind of auspiciousness fill the world, right? Chokun Teguchi means may every direction be filled with Dharma's auspiciousness. Okay? Beautiful prayer. Okay. Gyawa Di Gyao Kun Sonam Yeshe Soto Shin Sonam Yeshe Leichum Amba Kuni To. That's all. So this what we read, you should, for me, then
like,
I had good fortune to learn about the Lamrim tradition. And I also read when I can in the Lamrim. But then one thing about the Lamrim tradition for me is that if you understand kind of the Lamrim overall system, then there is no Dharma teaching which you can't introduce into your practice. So like this passage from Asanga's Shravaka is not directly discussed anywhere in any Lamrim text that I ever saw, but it certainly is very easy to know where it fits. And so for me, I'm at a point in my Dharma study where I try to take any other sort of extra or some kind of more subtle point that reading about in the commentaries or some of the more difficult treatises. Always I'm thinking where it fits into the Lamrim and to use it that way. Then I think if you do that, then definitely it will benefit your practice. So I'll leave you with that.
Thank you very much.